Insomniac, Spider-Man, Ratchet and Clank, Spyro. All of this started from one man's last $1,000 and a group of unlikely friends. In February of 1994, Insomniac's CEO once assumed making a console game would be easy. However, the reality of making and developing games would dawn on him. The journey would challenge him and his company and test them beyond what they thought was possible. And they would almost fail before even beginning. But how did some broke college students make their way to changing the gaming industry forever? This story starts with Ted Price. As a kid, he was a programmer and a self-proclaimed wannabe artist and animator with dreams of someday expressing these creative acts to tell stories. After high school, he would go on to pursue higher education at a university. You might not expect a future CEO of a gaming company to have an English bachelor's degree from Princeton, but what happened there would go on to change his life forever. Not only did he sharpen his writing skills, but he was also fortunate enough to meet just the right person to help him reach his dreams. Ted Price met Al Hastings there through a friend. Though they both went there, they never really had a chance to interact. Al was his alma mater, but through a friend, they connected. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Al got a call. It was Ted. Ted had gone on to make an LLC in order to develop games and pursue his passions. It was 1994, and it was Ted in a 10x10 office and an $8,000 3DO station he had spent his savings on. Ted had invited Al to join him and make a game. What's the company called? Extreme Software. Now that Al Hastings was there in that office with Ted, they needed a game. It was a month later, and as Ted put it, we were down to my last $1,000, which had to pay for the rent of my apartment, the rent on our office, our food, everything. I was thinking that this was gonna fail before it even started. They had recorded a demo of a first-person shooter engine that Al made, and with that demo, tried pitching a game to every publisher they could find, driving across California, getting rejected by everyone they met, and burning up the last of Ted's money in the half-empty tank in his Saturn car. Ted described Al's abilities to make a game as magic. He had made this FPS engine in a month. If they couldn't find a publisher, that talent would go to waste, and he would let his friend down. The phone rang. It was a friend who suggested, "You should talk to the people at Universal. They just started an interactive division." Ted realized this was our last shot. Nervously, they both drove up from San Diego to Los Angeles and talked to Mark Cerny, at the time the new executive producer at this new publisher. Seemingly impressed, he gave them a 3-game deal. This was an opportunity. After that, another call was made, this time to Al's brother, Brian Hastings, who worked at the hardware company Simons. Together, the three of them started to develop their first game, their first foot out the door into a whole new world. Their lives might have once been on some set path, but their futures were forever disrupted. Ted, Al, Mark, and Brian had worked tediously. Mark being like a mentor to Ted, giving him advice on production and how to design the levels. They were almost finished with their new game when they ran into an issue. Ted, Al, and Brian had intended on releasing this new game on the 3DO, but suddenly, the company tanked. The $8,000 Ted had spent on the 3DO dev station went up in ash. Extreme Software would need a new way to release the game. Ted was panicking. He could have been right. This might have been over before it even began. Mark Cerny and others at Universal suggested to Ted, Al, and Brian that maybe they could move this game over to a different console, the PlayStation. It was the new and trending console, and it could mean a jumpstart to their company. It was also risky, but Ted didn't think they could move everything over. This was a new system entirely. A light came out through the ashes. Al stopped him and very calmly answered, "Sure, no problem." Al ported the engine from the 3DO to the PlayStation in 2 weeks. Now they have finished their game. Ted's and everyone's dreams for the company were becoming more real by the day. But just before releasing their debut game, they got a letter. It was a cease and desist letter from Extreme, a database company, who requested them to change their company's name. It was last minute and they were about to release their game. They needed a new name fast. A lot of ideas got thrown around. Brian Hastings came up with Ice 9 as an homage to Cat's Cradle written by Kirk Vonnegut. Ted had liked it so much that they called Kirk's agent, who said that they had permission to use it, but they soon found out that someone else was already using it. More names were thrown out, but what really stuck was Insomniac. It wasn't their first choice, but it was the first one to pass their legal check. After all that hard work, Insomniac released their first game, a science fiction first-person shooter game called Disruptor. It was similar to a lot of other FPS games at the time, but had a unique mechanic system called psionics, which gave players the ability to launch short-range electrical blasts, restore health, and grant invincibility. Using this game mechanic and playing through the missions, the player, through the eyes of the protagonist Jack Curtis, would uncover a huge conspiracy. Their game was finally out there. But what was the reaction? Best said by Ted Price in an interview, quote, "It was definitely not a hit," end quote. Disruptor was well received, but only by the few people who had played it. Players praised the world building and intuitive controls, but it only garnered a small amount of attention. They only signed a 3-game deal with Universal. If the next couple of games didn't make them money, that would be the end. What they realized was that they needed to think about what the people wanted to play on the PlayStation. They needed to reflect on what worked and make a game that had a broader audience. Insomniac was anxious about what to do, but Mark Cerny came up to the Insomniac developers with an idea. What about family-friendly games? Wouldn't that reach a broader audience? Ted was once again struck with motivation, and the rest of the team started discussing ideas for a new game about a purple dragon. In the background, developers were trying to make PlayStation's new mascot. As Mario could represent Nintendo, people were struck with the curiosity of what could represent PlayStation. It was a discussion and a battle of mascots. Ultimately, it was Craig Stitt, one of Disruptor's environmental artists, that pushed Insomniac towards this direction with this fantastical image of a green dragon. He had always been fond of dragons. This character for their new game was designed by Charles Zimbias, but the textures were made by Craig, and both realized that maybe green wasn't the best color for their dragon, as during gameplay it would often be on green grass. Trying out new colors like red or black, they ultimately landed on purple. This new dragon started out with a gritty and dark depiction, but slowly morphed into a more child-friendly image. With a family-friendly approach, Insomniac could target a broader audience, which meant more players. Al Hastings worked on a new world engine, designed to make a medieval setting where their dragon could wander around. A lot of passion and work went into what seemed like could be their last chance. In September of 1998, Spyro the Dragon was released on PlayStation. Its popularity was only beaten by Naughty Dog's Crash Bandicoot, and all that talk about PlayStation's mascot, Spyro became one of the most recognizable faces for the PS1, only beaten by Crash Bandicoot. Still, second place never really sat right. They would eventually move on with a whole trilogy of Spyro games that kept them afloat, but it was time to let that all go. And that's when PlayStation's new console, the PS2, came out. During this, Ted, along with everyone at Insomniac, decided to cut ties with Universal and work more closely with Sony. Insomniac came up with a new pitch for the PS2, called Monster Night, but that never really went anywhere. There was a lot of change happening, which kind of made everything feel broken. With the future seeming uncertain, there was a lot of loose parts, and they needed a solution. What did they need to tighten it up? A Ratchet. The PS2 came out. Insomniac needed a new game fast. Ted brought out this new idea for Sony after cutting ties with Universal. They were going back to their roots, a mature action-adventure game known as Girl with a Stick. Ted had figured the PS2 had grown a more mature audience anyways. What could go wrong? Since Disruptor, their team has grown. Brian Alliger, who worked on the third Spyro game, started designing different prototypes, working with different ideas, specifically with maps. Months of development went into this game, but that work was never out of passion. Ted was becoming more business-minded with how he viewed this game, wanting to branch out the company and do something different, just for the sake of it, not out of love for the game. Ted thought to himself, after months of hearing negative feedback from other employees, and now producers who pushed them to play to their strengths, instead of trying to be something they're not, he thought to himself that this wasn't working. They scrapped the game. Insomniac, as a company, sat down and reflected on their failures, then quickly took the lessons they learned and looked forward. Brian Hastings came up with a new idea that would eventually become Ratchet and Clank. Ted Price thought, quote, "Things happen for a reason," end quote. And a passion relit in the offices of Insomniac as development for this game about a furry alien creature with insane tech and a robot friend began. Later, Ted and the others showed the Sony executives a demo, a breath of fresh air, a new mascot-based platform. And even Sony had said, quote, "It felt like the kind of game that people should play on the PlayStation 2." End quote. In 2002, Ratchet and Clank was released on the PlayStation 2. Insomniac's rise is inspiring. From Ratchet and Clank to now, there are still so many stories of facing uncertainty and learning from mistakes, and now they are an influential figure in the gaming industry. By the time that Ratchet and Clank was released, Insomniac found its footing. Sure, there were still setbacks, but failing became easier. With the success of Ratchet and Clank, they weren't just another gaming developer. The patterns present with their story are nothing short of beautiful, where feeling like this is your last chance might not be the end of the world, and looking back now, will make those times feel like the good old days.